Good morning, everybody. I'd like to thank Doyle, Rob, for inviting me to this event. Always been happy to be on Hour of the Time. How many of you are a little bit familiar with my work? Anybody? Some of you have heard me before on Hour of the Time or maybe other shows. Okay. Well, I was raised in a military family. My father was a Air Force intelligence officer, and family lived in a lot of places around the world. And I learned to have an open mind about things. I also could see that there are secrets in this world that not everybody knows about. There are things that were not taught in school. So I kind of followed up on some of these things. I became interested in different cultures, different philosophies, different ways of looking at the world. My travels eventually took me to India. I began studying that culture. So that has a lot to do with the reasons why I got into this topic that I call forbidden archaeology. I look at these questions from the standpoint of the ancient philosophy of India. Not just that. Basically, all these ancient philosophies, whether they're from Israel or Egypt or China or the American native peoples, they all present a picture of human history that's a little bit different than what we're normally taught in schools. And what I have tried to do in my work is bring these things to the attention of both the general public and the scientific world. I've been invited to speak about my work. When I say forbidden archaeology, I mean evidence that shows human beings have been around for a lot longer than most people now think possible. And many scientists, they don't like what I have to say, but some are a little more open-minded. And they've invited me to speak at some of the leading scientific institutions in the world, like the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. And what I present to them is the idea that in the writings of the ancient wisdom traditions, like the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, we find accounts of human civilizations going back tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years. I first presented these ideas to the scientific world in a paper that I presented at the World Archaeological Congress in 1994. And it involves the idea that time goes in vast cycles. Say if we look at the Native American peoples, they believe that time has gone on in vast cycles. We look at the Mayan calendar, which a lot of people are talking about these days, 2012 and all that. There's this idea that time goes in vast cycles. So the ancient philosophy of India also has this idea of time going in vast cycles, the basic name of the cycle is called the Day of Brahma. And during these cycles, which go very, very far back in time, human beings are always present. Right from the beginning of the cycles, not towards the end of the cycles, as most scientists now believe. And these ancient civilizations, they also spoke of ape men. Thousands of years ago, in the Vedic writings of India, they were talking about ape men that existed millions of years ago, just like scientists today are talking about this. But it's not a recent discovery. Long ago, the ancients knew that yes, there were ape men existing, but alongside them were existing human beings like ourselves. It's not that one came from the other, as the current theory of evolution tells us. Rather, they were coexisting with each other in these ancient times. Millions and millions of years ago. And this brings us to another topic. We may still be coexisting with some of these ape men today. Brings us to the topic of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the abominable snowman of the Himalayas, the Yeti. You find reports of these creatures which very much resemble the descriptions of the ape men that are supposed to have been gone extinct. So we are coexisting with them today, and we were coexisting with them millions and millions of years ago also. So the basic picture you get is not one of evolution, but of coexistence. Now, as Doyle said, if at any point any one of you have any question or comment you would like to make, I want you to feel free to do that. Raise a hand, ask whatever you want to ask, say whatever you want to say. So the ideas that I've just laid out for you, that human beings have existed on this planet for hundreds of millions of years, that we didn't evolve from the ape men, we coexisted with them. These are ideas that are very different than the ideas that come from Charles Darwin and his modern followers. They have a different idea. Basically, they believe that life began on Earth about 2 billion years ago. And they think there were some microorganisms that self-organized from chemicals in the Earth's early ocean. Then some fish developed, then other animals, until about 40 or 50 million years ago, you get the first apes and monkeys. Then about 6 million years ago, the first ape men. And then finally, about 100,000 years ago, they say, the first human beings like us appeared on Earth. Before that, there were no human beings like us, they say. And they say that all the physical evidence supports that idea. But when I did 8 years of research into the whole history of archaeology, I found something different. I found that over the past 150 years, archaeologists have discovered much evidence showing that humans like us have existed throughout this whole period of time. And this evidence takes the form of human skeletons, human artifacts, human footprints. many, many millions of years old, going all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth. But you're not going to read about this evidence in your textbooks because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. You know, we can call this blue box here the knowledge filter. And what it represents is the fixed ideas most scientists now have about this question of human origins. Of course, this is the Darwinian idea that they have now. So reports of evidence that conform to these fixed ideas will pass through this filter very easily, which means students will read about this evidence in their textbooks. People will see scientists talking about it on television. If you go to the local museum, you'll see these things. But if we have evidence that radically contradicts these fixed ideas, it is filtered out, which means you're not going to read about it in the textbooks. You're not going to see scientists talking about it on television. And if you go to the local museum, you're not going to see these things, even though they may be there somewhere in the museum collections. So what I'd like to do now is go over some examples of the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. And I'm going to start with some evidence that's kind of close in time to what most scientists are now prepared to accept. As I said, most scientists now believe human beings like us first came into existence about 100,000 years ago. So I'm going to start with some cases that are older than that, but still sort of close to that. And then I'm going to go further, further, and further back in time. So this is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's an American geologist who I know personally. She lives in Colorado. And when she was a young woman just beginning her scientific career, she was involved in dating an archaeological site called Huayatlaco in Mexico. It's in central Mexico. It's near the town of Puebla. And there, the archaeologists discovered many stone tools and weapons, and they may look kind of primitive to us, but according to archaeologists, they're the kind of things that only human beings of our type would have made. And they don't think that any kind of ape man could have made these things. So, of course, the archaeologists who dug these things up wanted to know how old they were. So they called a team of geologists to date the site. This is the archaeologist who was in charge of the excavation, Cynthia Irwin Williams. And this is the excavation at Huayatlaco. It was a very professional excavation. And as I said, they found stone tools and weapons in the solid rock in their excavations. This is one of the stone tools that they found. And they were solidly embedded in the rock. And they wanted to know how old these stone tools were. So they brought in a team of geologists. Virginia Steen McIntyre was the head of the team. So she and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date this site. First of all, they used the uranium series method to date some animal bones that were found in the same layers with the stone tools. these animal bones had cut marks on them, which means somebody was using those tools to butcher those animals, get the meat from them. So there aren't any scientific methods that will let them directly date the stone tool to tell when it was made into an artifact. So, but there is a method that they could date the bones, the animal bones that were found in the same layers with them. So the method they used is called the uranium series method. And using this method, they got a maximum age of about 245,000 years. So they also used another method to date this site, because above the layer with the stone tools, there was a layer of volcanic ash. So they were able to use the zircon fission track method to date that layer of ash. They got an age of 270,000 years. And then they used another method called tetrahydration, which confirmed these ages. And they also looked at the stratigraphy, the different layers. They could see that the artifact layers had originally been covered by about 150 feet of deposits that had gradually been worn down by erosion. So they knew the rate of erosion, so they could calculate how long it took for those layers to erode. So using all four methods that they used, the geologists concluded the site must be 250,000 years old. But the archaeologists said, that is impossible. Human beings capable of making these artifacts did not exist 250,000 years ago anywhere in the world. What to speak of North America? Because according to the current theories, no human beings entered North America until about 20,000 years ago. That's their theory. They believe that at that time, some people came over from Siberia into Alaska, down through Canada, down through the United States, down to Mexico, then from there to South America. So, of course, the Native American peoples don't believe that. They don't say our ancestors came here 20,000 years ago from Siberia. They don't say that at all. They've always been here, according to their theories, their beliefs. But so the archaeologists just said this date of 250,000 years is completely impossible. So they refused to publish the age for the site given by their own hand-picked team of geologists. You know, they invited these geologists to come there, date the site, and they came up with a date that they didn't like. So they refused to publish it. This is how this knowledge filtering process works. So Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues were a little upset by this. They say, we're just scientists doing our job. We can't help it if it contradicts your theory. This is the geology. This is the age of the site, 250,000 years. So what the geologists did is they independently publish the age for the site in this scientific journal. But when Virginia Steen McIntyre did that, she experienced an extreme negative backlash from her colleagues in the world of geology. And they started calling her a troublemaker, a maverick, a publicity. See, how could you do this? How could you do such a thing? Don't you know that human beings didn't exist 250,000 years ago? Why are you doing this? So although she had been a rising star in her field of geology, after she published this paper, her career was effectively finished because she had dared to publish something that contradicted the Darwinian theory of evolution. That is something you just don't do in the academic and scientific world today. So she lost a teaching position that she held at a university. And as I said, her career was effectively finished at this point. So, these are the kinds of pressures that can be brought to bear on people like this. Yes?
I'd just like to know if these uranium series and zircon fission types of dating systems are accepted elsewhere in the scientific community, many times over.
Yes, they are. So the question is, for the benefit of the camera, they want me to repeat these questions. So the question is, are these uranium series dates and zircon fission track datings, are these accepted scientific methods? And yes, they are. But as with any scientific dating method, you can always start trying to say, well, it's got to be wrong somehow. Somebody did something wrong. Some samples were contaminated. But these are professionals who are doing these things, and they were very careful in what they did. So it appears that the main reason why they objected to these dates was because they contradicted the theory of evolution. Therefore, they decided something's got to be wrong with these dates. They must have made some mistake somehow, but they can't point out what the mistake is. It's sort of like maybe there's a building inspector and he's got a big list of rules. So maybe he goes, somebody's his friend. So he looks at his place and he says, okay, yeah, it's fine. But maybe there's somebody he doesn't like. And he starts going through the rule book. And you can always find something wrong. You can always find some little thing wrong. That's not the code there, sorry. We're going to have to shut you down. Or sometimes a policeman too. He can look at your car or something. He can find something wrong with it. Some reason to give you a ticket if he wants. So it's sort of like, it's a double standard. When these same methods are used in cases that give dates that support the accepted theories, all little flaws and details, they're just overlooked. But if the very same methods are used and they give a date that contradicts some deeply held theory, then they start looking for anything that could possibly be wrong. But another thing to keep in mind is that this case was completely buried in the 1990s. But I found out about this case in my research for my book, Forbidden Archaeology. And I included this case in that book, Forbidden Archaeology. Then there was a television producer in New York named Bill Coty. He was thinking about doing a documentary that he was calling The Mysterious Origins of Man. And somehow or other, he got a hold of my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and he read about some of these cases. So I became a consultant for the television program. I appeared on that program. It was a very, it appeared on NBC. It's called The Mysterious Origins of Man. And, I introduced him to Virginia Steen McIntyre, and he took her down to Mexico, and she showed him the site, explained the whole thing to him. So it was on national TV. And there was a wealthy gentleman who was interested in archaeology that who saw that program, and he decided to fund some new research. So there was some new research going on. There has been down there. There was, and what they have found, I believe, shows that the dates that Virginia Steen McIntyre and her colleagues got are correct. They reaffirm the nature of her dates. They redid some of the dates. They came up with the same dates. And they even tried some new methods that also confirmed the dates that she originally got. So this story, it hasn't really ended yet. And I'm kind of happy to say that the work that I did kind of resulted in this case being reopened. And we'll see eventually what happens. But that's a very good question. So yes, this uranium series method, it is one of the standard scientific dating methods. The zircon fission track method is a standard scientific dating method. They're widely used by archaeologists and geologists and paleontologists to date things. Anyone else have something? Yes.
Has carbon-14, or the radiocarbon dating, has it been proven to be inaccurate?
These dating methods, I believe, are based on some sound scientific principles. But in any particular case, there could be a problem. For example, the radiocarbon method, the carbon-14 method that you just mentioned, is based on the idea there are two kinds of carbon in living things, carbon-14 and carbon-12. Carbon-12 is not radioactive. Carbon-14 is radioactive. If something's radioactive, that means it decays into other elements. And the rate of decay is expressed in what they call a half-life. That means, say if you start with a certain amount of carbon-14, then after the half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,000 years. So that means after 5,000 years, you have half of what you started out with. After another 5,000 years, you have half of what you started out with. After another 5,000 years, you got half of what you started out, of what was there. Then another 5,000 years, half. By the time, so what happens is that your amount of carbon-12 stays the same. Your amount of carbon-14 gradually goes down. And by about 50,000 years, not enough left to measure any more half-lives. So I mean, actually, if you go to a newer method of carbon-14 dating called accelerator mass spectrometry, they can take it back to about 100,000 years. So that method really wouldn't apply in this case here because we're talking about things that are older than that. But here's something that could potentially happen, however. If a sample that you're trying to date, say like you have a bone that's really 1,000,000 years old, if it got contaminated with the least amount of modern carbon-14, the bone, even though it's 1,000,000 years old, would show an age of 100,000 years or less. And there's a lot of ways in which a bone can become contaminated with carbon. First of all, like even if you just touch it, you know the skin has oils on it. And those oils contain carbon-14. So just by even touching, like a bone, you could contaminate it with some recent carbon. Or it could come in from the groundwater. Say the bone's 1,000,000 years old, but there's water coming down from the surface that has carbon in it, from fertilizers or just from the soil, or there could be bacteria that enter the bone and die there. Their bodies would have recent carbon-14 in them. So there's a lot of ways in which a sample could become contaminated with recent carbon. And so that even though a bone might be 1,000,000 years old, if they dated it using this method, it would show an age of 100,000 years or less. So there have to be very, very careful purification techniques done when they're doing these dating methods to make sure that they're not dating recent carbon that may have contaminated the sample. It's possible to do these things, but so it's the same with all of these methods. They're based on sound scientific principles, but in any particular case, you would have to be careful. The main thing that they have to be careful of is contamination of the samples with recent elements, be they uranium or carbon or like that. So now some people who favor a very, very young age for the Earth would have more problems with these dating methods than I would. I accept a long age, for the Earth. People who believe in a very, very young age for the Earth, say 5,000 or 10,000 years, would have a lot more problems with these methods than I would. So that's something to keep in mind. Yes?
Who would you consider some of those people that would consider the age of 5,000 years?
Oh, okay. Like when my book Forbidden Archaeology came out, Dwayne Gish of the Creation Research Society got a hold of a copy of it, and he really liked the book. He's a young Earth Christian creationist. And I went out and met him, and we had a lot that we agreed on. We just disagreed about the age of the Earth. So say my book Forbidden Archaeology was reviewed by Creation Research Society Quarterly, which is the main scientific journal of the young Earth Christian creationist movement. They gave it a very favorable review. And they said, although we disagree with Mr. Cremo, Mr. Thompson about the age of the Earth, we agree with them that human beings have been here since the beginning. So what I usually tell of those folks is, well, whether the Earth is a few thousand or a few billion years old, human beings have been there since the beginning, and they didn't evolve from apes. So at least that much we agree on. We would have a disagreement about the age of the Earth. But even within, say, the Christian creationist movement, you've got same disagreement. There are some who accept a young age for the Earth. They're called young Earth creationists. Then they're old Earth creationists as well. So, that's. Personally, I don't claim to have a monopoly on truth. I think truth can be found in many places. And I was really happy that the young Earth Christian creationists liked my book, although they disagreed with me about the age of the Earth. So, to directly answer your question, that's who I was alluding to.
Could you repeat that name? Could you repeat that name, please?
Huh?
Could you repeat that name, please?
Dwayne Gish? Yeah, he at least at the time, I don't know if he still is, he was one of the leaders of the in San Diego, there's a creation research organization that he was one of the leaders of. Yes.
Do you know maybe what their contention would be, and maybe why they wouldn't want to admit or accept or try to think that even that could be true, that the Earth is that much older, like in their philosophical doctrine, say, do you know, have a opinion
Well,
why they wouldn't be able to accept that, say something in the scripture that they cite, or what have you?
Of course, the best thing would be to ask Dwayne Gish about it, but as far as I know, I don't like to, represent what other people say. But since you're asking this question, from what I can see is that they look at the genealogies in the Bible, and you can add up, this one lived for so many years, this one lived from so many years, all the way back to the time of the flood. That's something I also believe in. I believe there have been repeated catastrophes, on Earth, massive floods and things like that. But they think they can trace, by calculating the genealogies, they can trace it back, to about 5,000, 10,000 years, about something in that range. There are others who say that, looking at things from, like a biblical perspective. Like I said, I don't really like to talk so much about, how people, interpret their scriptures and things like that. But since you asked the question, from what I can tell, there's some that will say, there's some passages in the Bible that say one of his years, his being God's, are like 10,000 of ours or something. So they try to expand, what these years mean. And I'll let them settle that among themselves. But these are questions that come up, and I think they're legitimate questions. But the thing that we would agree on, although we might disagree about the age of the Earth, myself, and like I said, myself, I tend to approach things from the standpoint of the Vedic writings of India, which speak about these long time cycles. But what we would agree on is whether we think the Earth is a few thousand or a few billion years old, humans have always been there, and they didn't evolve from the apes. Anything else on this point? Okay, we'll go a little further ahead here. Oh, I was mentioning some of the new research that's gone on down there at Huayatlaco. There's another geologist named Sam Van Landingham from the United States who has studied the diatoms there. Diatoms are they're small little creatures that leave like a little kind of skeleton made out of calcium. And they're all different kinds. They sort of look like little calcium, if you look under a microscope, they're sort of like little snowflakes. They all have different little shapes and things like that. There are lots of diatoms, lots of kinds of these diatoms, they're called, these microscopic little living creatures that leave this little tiny skeleton. They're round. They're kind of round things. They leave these round, hard little skeletons. And there are hundreds of different kinds. And by studying the different kinds, you can tell what time period they belong to. So he said that the kinds of diatoms that you find at this site, Huayatlaco, support the ages that Virginia Steen McIntyre gave. So now we're going to go back a little further in time. This is a site at Schöningen in northern Germany. And there what the archaeologists found were wooden spears that were shaped exactly like modern Olympic javelins. They were obviously like a weapon that was made for throwing and killing animals. And actually, they found butchered animal bones along with these wooden spears. So they were found in layers of rock about 430,000 years old. And the archaeologists wrote an article about them in a scientific journal called Nature, which is considered to be the world's preeminent scientific journal. They wrote about these lower Paleolithic hunting spears. They were found in layers of rock about 430,000 years old. Now the problem was, who made them? Well, they decided it couldn't be human beings like us, because according to their theories, human beings like us did not exist 400,000 years ago. So who did exist 400,000 years ago? They believe it was an ape man that lived in Europe called Homo heidelbergensis. So they said, obviously, these spears had to have been made by this ape man. It's a variety of Homo erectus. That's a scientific name for this ape man. Now that was a bit unusual because before this time, nobody had ever thought that this ape man could have done anything like that. They thought the only being capable, intelligent enough to make like these very, very well-made throwing spears for throwing and hunting and killing animals were human beings like us. They didn't believe that ape men had that ability. And actually, the oldest spears that they had before this discovery were less than 100,000 years old, within what they considered to be the range of our species, the time range of our human species, anatomically modern human species. So But they said, okay, humans like us didn't exist 400,000 years ago. Only this ape man existed at that time. So it must have been this ape man who made those spears. But I think there's another explanation of who made those spears. And it has to do with some discoveries that were made in northern France in the 19th century by Jacques Boucher de Perthes, who was one of the founders of modern archaeology. He lived in the 19th century. Of course, Darwin lived in the 19th century. Einstein lived in the 19th century. I mean, a lot of people, they think, well, anything that was done in the 19th century, how could it possibly be true? Well, Darwin made his theory of evolution in the 19th century too. So if you want to say that we can't accept anything that was done in the 19th century, you might as well give up Darwin too. I don't believe that all science that was done, before, January 1st, 1900 is bad science. But in any case, he made some discoveries in northeastern France at a place called Abbeville. And one of the things he found was this human jaw. It's an anatomically modern human jaw, just like that of a modern human being. And he found it in this layer of his excavation, along with many stone tools and weapons. And according to modern geologists, this layer here at Abbeville is about 430,000 years old. Now, at the time of this discovery, it was very controversial because many scientists could not believe that humans existed so far in the past. They thought, this is impossible. So some of them came up with an explanation. They said, here's what obviously happened. We know human beings could not have been living that far in the past. So here's what happened. Somebody must have gone to some Roman cemetery, cemetery about 2,000 years old or something, and they took a jawbone from one of the graves in that cemetery. Then they went to the excavation, planted it there, and that's how it happened. So Boucher de Perthes, he was just shocked, that anybody would dare, say he'd been a victim of a hoax like that. So what he did is very interesting. He conducted some new excavations at that place. And these excavations were witnessed by other scientists. And in these new excavations that were witnessed by other professional scientists, medical doctors, and others who were just watching, to make sure that nothing was strange was going on, nobody was sneaking in and throwing bones into the pit. And in these new excavations, they uncovered 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth, which I believe confirmed that the original discovery was also genuine. But the thing is in the textbooks today, you only read this hoax story, and you never read about the additional excavations that were made and the 100 additional anatomically modern human bones and teeth that were found there. You do not read about that. All you read is the hoax story. Sort of like at Roswell, all you read about is the weather balloon story in the official accounts. You don't read about all the other evidence that's there. So I believe that those new discoveries, they confirm that the original one was made. So what you've got here is evidence that human beings like us were existing 430,000 years ago in Europe, And I would say it was some of those human beings who made those very advanced wooden throwing spears that were found by the German archaeologists in the 1990s. So, I gave a report about this whole case at a major international conference on history of science, and it was later published in the peer-reviewed conference proceedings volumes. So I think what we're going to do now before we go on, we're going to go on to other cases. See, now we started out with 250,000 years at Huayatlaco. Now we're back to 430,000 years. We're going to keep going further and further back in time. We're going to go back to 1 million years, 10 million years, 100 million years over the course of the morning. So, but as promised, now I'm going to ask one more time for questions right now, and then we're going to take a break for 10 minutes or so, and then come back and go into the next level. The next level. So anybody have anything now? Any final question before the break? Okay. So let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll start up again at 9:40. Thank you. On Flores Island, and they published their report in Nature. Some of the artifacts they found there. The artifacts were found in this layer of their excavation, which was dated using the zircon fission track method as being about 800,000 years old. But again, they had to decide who made these things. And again, they decided, well, it could not have been human beings like us, because human beings like us did not exist 800,000 years ago. So who did exist 800,000 years ago in that part of the world? Again, the ape-man Homo erectus. So they decided, well, Homo erectus must have made those stone tools. But there was a problem with that. And the problem is that Flores Island is separated from the nearest land by wide expanses of ocean. Now this map shows the area as it looked about 800,000 years ago, at a time when the sea levels were lower than they are today. So you've got the coast of Southeast Asia, it comes out further. The coast of Australia comes out further, but still, I mean, it's separated from nearest land by wide expanses of ocean. So the problem is, how did the ape man, Homo erectus, get to Flores Island? So the archaeologists proposed something very radical. They proposed, well, he must have made a boat and sailed there. Now, I mean, this was a bit unusual because up to this time, nobody had ever thought the ape-man Homo erectus did any such thing. Archaeologists and anthropologists believe that only human beings like us made boats and deliberately sailed across the ocean. And actually the oldest evidence they had for that was about 50,000 years old from some Mediterranean islands in Europe. Because in the Mediterranean Sea, there's some islands, there's some human remains there. So they proposed, well, they got there by boat, and that sort of fit. But to have this ape-man, Homo erectus, doing it 800,000 years ago was pretty unusual. But I think there's another answer to the question, who made the stone tools that were found on Flores Island, and how did he get there? And I think the answer lies in Java. Well, if we go back here, Java's here, it's part of Indonesia. And I think the answer to this question, who made those stone tools, lies here. It was in Java that the very first bones of Homo erectus were found in the 1890s by a Dutch scientist named Eugene Dubois. So he found this skull cap, very primitive skull cap, and he also found this thigh bone or femur. He put the two together, just these two bones, the skull cap, the femur, and said, here we have the Java ape man, which he originally called Pithecanthropus erectus, and today it's known as Homo erectus. And this is a very famous discovery. It's mentioned in all the textbooks, Java man. But here's something that we don't see mentioned in the textbooks. Some British scientists, they later carefully examined this femur, which supposedly belonged to the ape-man Homo erectus. And they did this in the 1970s. They said it's completely identical in every respect to a modern human thigh bone or femur. And they found it was completely different from any Homo erectus ape-man thigh bone that was found after this first one. So they concluded this thigh bone did not belong with that ape-man skull. Now that's kind of interesting because, this is their report about this, the human nature of this femur. It's published in the scientific journal. Now it's kind of unusual because according to Dubois, this is Dubois' map of where he found the bones. He found the skull cap and the femur in the exact same layer, which according to modern geologists is about 800,000 years old. So, what that suggests to me is there were two kinds of beings living in Java 800,000 years ago. Yeah, there were some ape men there. There were some Homo erectus ape men there, as indicated by this very primitive skull cap. But there were also some human beings like us living there 800,000 years ago, as shown by the anatomically modern human thigh bone or femur that was found in the exact same layer. And I would say it was members of that human population who made the boats, sailed across the seas to Flores Island, and left the stone tools there. So, say, whenever you go to a scientific conference, you have to have a joke slide. So when I went to, I presented everything I'm talking to you today about, I've presented at meetings of the World Archaeological Congress or the European Association of Archaeologists or other scientific conferences or scientific institutions. So what I tell the scientists is, look, we don't have to explain this evidence, we don't have to try to raise Homo erectus to the human level, which is what they try to do to explain, this evidence. There is evidence that humans like us were present 400,000 years ago in Europe, 800,000 years ago in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. So any questions about this case? Yes. How did the Java man get there? Depends who you're asking. How did he get to Java? Let's go back to the. Let's see. Go back to. Now, according to the standard theories, what you learn in the textbooks, they would say about a little over 2 million years ago, Homo erectus, this ape-man Homo erectus, was living in Africa. Left Africa, went to the Middle East, across the Middle East, then down into Southeast Asia. And see, at that time, when the sea levels were lower, Java was not an island as it is today. It was connected to the landmass of Asia. And so then that Homo erectus came down into Java. Some of them went north into China, like that. That's what the mainstream scientific explanation would be of how Java man got to Java. But they would think there were no human beings like us at that time. They would think maybe about maybe 1 million years ago or 1.5 million years ago, they got to Java and they stayed there. So then they would think later, about 100,000 years ago, human beings like us first arose in Africa and then went out of Africa and wiped out all the ape men all over the world. That's what they would say. Yes.
I have a question. I've noticed in archaeological findings and that references are always made to ape men. Did they ever find ape women?
No, they never did. No, yes, of course they did. Well, let's just call them ape persons then. Will be. Yeah, I'm just using standard terminologies. To be, perfectly correct, we could call them. I mean, I didn't want to use technical terms like hominins. They have names. They have technical scientific names for. Trying to use the common terminologies for these people, and not burden everybody with a lot of, technical Latin names. But technically, they would be called hominins, and they'd be called early hominins, and they would have specific species names like Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus this, that, the other. So we could use the technical terminologies, but I think for our purposes, we can use ape people if we like. A very good point. Excellent point. But yes, they can tell. Of course, this even comes up in modern. If you watch these television shows like CSI and stuff like that, you can learn some things about how they identify skeletons as male or female. There are certain features that will allow them to, as they call sex, the skeletons. But yes, they do find female remains as well. Also, infant remains, and they find all kinds of things. But to get back to the point, they would say, the Homo erectus arose in Africa, spread throughout Asia, Europe. Then they would say about between 100 and 200,000 years ago, human beings like us arose in Africa, and then they went out and they wiped out everybody else. The Neanderthals, the Homo erectus, wiped them out. What I'm proposing is that, if we look carefully, we see there's evidence that humans like us were existing at the same time as these supposed human ancestors, like Homo erectus, the Neanderthals, the Australopithecines. Just like here in Java, you've got evidence that humans were existing, humans like us were existing, anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, sapiens, that's what they're called technically. So that's how they would say, Java man got to Java. Okay, so we got back to about 800,000 years with evidence for anatomically modern humans. And now we're going to go to Buenos Aires, where in the early part of the 20th century, an anatomically modern human skull was found. And it was found here. This is 15 meters, about 15 yards, 45 feet below the surface. Then they encountered this, a thick layer of limestone rock, which they call, in Spanish, tosca, like a very thick layer of limestone rock. And then they broke through that layer, and then they found the skull directly below that, a human skull. And it was found in the Pre-Encenadan Formation, which according to modern geologists is 1.5 million years old. That's the age of the formation below the limestone layer. And it's an anatomically modern human skull. Now this detail here, that there's this thick layer of hard limestone rock, is very important. Because that means that that skull cannot have come down from some higher, more recent level. That's the usual kind of counter-explanation that's given. You've got a human skull and some very ancient layer of rock. Well, it came down through some crack or fissure from some higher level. That's why you think, you found some human bone and some very, very ancient layer of rock. Now, what rules that out is the presence of this unbroken layer of limestone rock that completely sealed off the skull from the surface. So here what we've got is a human skull, 1.5 million years old. And this discovery was reported to the scientific world by Florentino Ameghino, who was a very prominent South American scientist, Argentine scientist. Now this is an interesting case. There's this shell that has a simple but very recognizable human face carved on it. It was found in the year 1881 by the British geologist Henry Stopes, who reported on it at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And today, scientists think that the first carved bones and things like that go back only about 77,000 years. This is what they consider to be the oldest sign of deliberate human artwork on bone or shell, going back. And you can see it's very simple, just some lines scratched on a piece of bone. But really, such evidence goes much further back in time than that, because that shell, that carved shell, was found at this place, Walton-on-Naze, in the east coast of England. It was found in the Red Crag Formation, which goes back about 2 million years. So here you've got evidence of a carved shell with a human face carved on it, about 2 million years old. So you can see how we're going further and further back in time. This is the beach at Walton-on-Naze, and this is the Red Crag Formation here. You can see it's a reddish color, and that's where this shell was discovered. And you can still see shells there today. These shells are over 2 million years old. But you can see that these are plain. They don't have anything carved on them. So one suggestion is, well, maybe somebody just took one of these shells, carved a little human face on it, and that's the explanation. It's not really, there wasn't anybody around 2 million years ago to carve the face on the human shell. Somebody just went there recently and took the shell out, carved a little face on it, and that's the explanation. But what rules that out is these shells are very, very delicate. Like I said, they're 2 million years old, and they are so delicate that if you tried to carve on, they would just crumble to dust. So that explanation really doesn't work. And this is the daughter of Henry Stopes. Like after her father announced this discovery, some people made this claim that no, it's really not a human carving from 2 million years ago. Somebody just took a little shell from the beach and carved a little face on it and gave it to your father, who's a professional geologist and knows all about these things. And so she said, no, that's, she's the one who pointed out that these shells are so delicate that if anybody had tried to do that, they would have just crumbled into dust. And she further pointed out that that if somebody had tried to do that, the surface would have looked different than the present surface of the shell. So she gave a very detailed explanation why that explanation really wouldn't work. Now, there's some additional reasons for thinking there may have been human beings around in that part of England around 2 million years ago to carve the shell. In the 19th century, an anatomically modern human jaw was found at a place called Foxhall, which is sort of in the same part of England. It's near Ipswich here. And this is Foxhall Hall, which is on the outskirts of Ipswich. And somebody was doing some excavations there, and they found this anatomically modern human jaw in the Red Crag Formation, the same Red Crag Formation that the carved shell was found in, and that's about 2 million years old. So then after that, in the early 20th century, around 1920, an English researcher went there, and it looks like we've lost this. So the question is, what does the depth at which an object or bone is found have to do with its age? That depends on the particular situations. Generally, like geology is based on the idea that if things are in their normal order, the deeper layers would be the older ones. But how old they are depends on a lot of things, because there can be situations in which layers could accumulate very rapidly. So, for example, when there have been these catastrophic events like Mount St. Helens going off, huge amounts of volcanic ash come out and they accumulate very, very rapidly. So you can get just hundreds of feet of deposits accumulate very, very rapidly. So that means even something found very deep in them wouldn't necessarily be that old. So a lot depends on the ability of scientists to date, the different layers. For example, at Laco, there were some volcanic layers above the layer of stone tools. So that they were able to use the zircon fission track method to date that layer of volcanic ash as being, about, over 300,000 years old. That means anything under it must be at least that old. The same thing like with this skull found in Buenos Aires. There was a layer of rock above it that was unbroken that was able to be dated. So a lot depends on the situation. Of course, there are some cases where older layers can be shoved over, older layers can be shoved over newer layers. So a lot depends on the dating of the different layers, if that can be done. But in some cases, in general, the deeper a thing is, the older it is. That's the general rule.
So that generally presupposes that the Earth is getting bigger?
What it presupposes is that fossils, artifacts are generally found in what's called layers of sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is rock like sandstone, limestone. It's originally mud or sand or something like that gets deposited by rivers or lakes.
The idea is that this is moved in on top of it?
No, there's different, say like if you have a river, for example, and each year it floods, and when it floods, it lays down a layer of sediment. And then the next year, it may lay down sediment on top of that. So over the course of many years, you get many layers of sediments being laid down. And then maybe at a certain point, there's some earth movements, that raise the whole thing up. And so the river is no longer there. And then those things will turn into, gradually over time, layers of stone.
Layers are getting one on top of the other. The earth must be.
But there's also erosion going on too, at the same
Really
time.
movement, not the whole thing.
No, I mean, like, erosion can take place. I mean, layers of sediment can be laid down, but then erosion can come and wear them down again. If you look at the whole geological history of the Earth, the way that geologists look at it, mountains are raised, they're kind of worn down, and the deposits that were once mountains are kind of deposited in valleys and things like that. And then mountains come up again, and geologists tell us that 90% of the sedimentary layers that have ever been laid down are now gone. They've been worn away by erosion and other geological processes. So, okay, we're back.
For a while.
Okay. Okay. Which is really interesting because these fossils are deposited in layers of sedimentary rock. And they're constantly being deposited and eroded. And geologists tell us that over 90% of the sedimentary layers that have ever been laid down on Earth are now gone, which means we don't really have a complete record, of the history of life on Earth. It's like, say you have a book, it's 1,000 pages long, and then you just rip out 900 of those pages. You don't have the whole story. And then there's the problem of knowledge filtering. The people that are looking sometimes have their ideas about what should be there and what shouldn't be there. If things don't fit their theory, then they ignore those. So there really isn't a complete record, for us to really examine. But if we carefully look at everything that is there. And what I've tried to do is show you things that are there, but you're not going to find in the textbooks. Say, I remember when I went to school, I looked at the theory, there's a theory of evolution, here's the evidence. The evidence matches the theory, so I had no reason to question it. It must be true because, well, here are all the facts. Here's what the theory says. The facts go along with the theory must be true. No reason to question it, no reason to doubt it. It really wasn't until, I started looking into things and discovering that actually the textbooks aren't presenting all the facts. I was really surprised when I started this research. I thought, I just had some suspicions, from my study of different ancient wisdom traditions or even the Bible, well, that things could be different than what we're being told in the textbooks. And I thought, well, let me look and see if there is any evidence that shows for example, that human beings have been here for millions and millions of years. I thought, okay, I might find, a couple of interesting cases, one or two, and, I'll just write a short little article about them, and then I'll go on to something else. But when I started this, I thought I might do about 8 days of research. I just might start looking into different archives and things like that, find a few interesting facts, write a short little article about it, and then go on to something else. But I found, when I started that research, the 8 days turned into 8 weeks. The 8 weeks turned into 8 months. The 8 months turned into 8 years. Because yes, I did find a few cases, but those led to other cases. There would be some little footnote. Yes, some scientist in Europe, he claimed to have found, this something or other skeleton, but it's complete nonsense. Well, I would follow up on that little footnote. I'd go look up his report, see if it really was nonsense. I find, well, it wasn't nonsense. He was a very, very reputable scientist. He'd done very careful work. He'd found something that showed human beings were present a very long time ago in a very convincing way. And then he would mention, some other little discovery that somebody else had made. And then I'd follow that out. And then I'd follow that and that and that. And it took me about 8 years to kind of get to the point where I really wasn't finding a whole lot more. But in that 8 years of research, I compiled enough evidence to kind of fill up a 900-page book, which Luke here got somewhere along the line. It's called Forbidden Archaeology. Some people call it forbidding archaeology because, it's a little heavy. But you can work out with it. You can get some exercise. Yeah.
Question. In your search, for your discoveries and everything like that, your resources, were they the library? Were they the internet, the information highway? Were they...
Well, I started this research. So the question is, how was this research done? So I started this research in the 1980s, before there really was, a very highly developed internet. And even today, you're not going to find a lot of this stuff on the internet, which leads to, this is Lori Erbs here, my research assistant, who is, professionally trained librarian with a Master's of Science, Master of Library Science from, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she was running a scientific, before, she started helping me in my research, she was running a scientific research laboratory for library, scientific research library for an agency of the U.S. government, the Forest Service in Alaska. And, she'd found out about the work of my colleague and I, Richard Thompson, and asked if there were anything, she could do to help out. So, to get the kind of, most of my research has been looking for old, out-of-print documents, rare scientific journals in all different languages from all over the world. And getting this kind of stuff is not easy. You have to know where these things are, how to get them. So for that sort of thing, Lori's been absolutely essential. And there are others too that have also helped. With the research for the book. But my ongoing research, it really depends a lot on people like Lori especially, and then also when I'm on radio shows and things like that, people will call in and give leads. I've learned a lot from meetings like this. People come, well, my uncle was a coal miner, and and he found something, and he showed it to the foreman, and the foreman said, "Shut up about that." So the information, I'm doing what you might say an archaeology of archaeology. And basically, I've been looking for documented studies. And now once I have that, then I often go to the museums and try to find the artifacts and get pictures of them and go visit the original sites and try to relocate the sites and things like that. But the foundation for the kind of research that I do means going into all kinds of archives all over the world where there's rare out-of-print documents and things that you're not going to find on the internet even. And somebody who knows library systems, information systems can be very helpful.
And you're dealing
in that.
with knowledge filtration too.
Yes. And I'm going to be explaining some cases like that, explaining some of the difficulties that there are in getting access to this information. I mean, it's what you see in films like Raiders of the Lost Ark, going into the Smithsonian, like the basements of the Smithsonian. It may seem like, well, it's all just Hollywood, but it is a fact that there are hidden archives, there are things like that, definitely. And I'm going to be touching on some of those cases as we go on. So to kind of stick to our schedule, we'll take another 10-minute break now, and if you all come back in 10 minutes, we'll go further back in time. We can see we've already broken the 1 million year barrier, the 2 million year barrier. So we're going to go back even further in time. So, we were talking about the discoveries of J. Reed Moore in the Foxhall area. Just a little reminder, we had that carved shell which was found in eastern England, about 2 million years old. The human jaw that was found also in eastern England at about 2 million years old. All the stone tools that were found by J. Reed Moore at Foxhall in the same layer where the human jaw was found in the Red Crag Formation, again about 2 million years old. So they all fit together. Human jaw, carved shell, human-made tools. So there was an American anthropologist named Henry Fairfield Osborn who wrote in 1920, "The discoveries of J. Reed Moore of evidence of the existence of Pliocene man in East Anglia open a new epoch in archaeology." The Pliocene is a geological period that goes back about 2 million years. So he's pointing out, yes, these are very important discoveries. They bring indubitable evidence of the existence of man in southeast Britain, man of sufficient intelligence to fashion flints and build fire before the close of the Pliocene. So these discoveries were being very widely advertised in the scientific world in the 1920s, showing the existence of human beings in England going back over 2 million years. But then gradually these things started disappearing, from the textbooks. Scientists stopped talking about them. And today you won't read anything like that in the textbooks. So go back to Argentina, back to South America. some interesting discoveries were made at a place called Miramar on the Atlantic coast of Argentina, a little south of Buenos Aires. And the discoveries were made at this place on the seashore, a little bit north of the town of Miramar. There are some cliffs on the seashore, and in these cliffs there are many animal bones. And this is the interesting discovery. This is not a human bone. It's the bone of an extinct South American mammal called a toxodon. A toxodon would be kind of like a little hippopotamus with fur on it. It's an extinct mammal. You don't see them in South America anymore. And the most interesting feature of this bone is that it has a flint arrowhead solidly embedded in it. And this bone is 3 million years old. So archaeologists believe that arrows, bow and arrow, that's a weapon made only by humans like us, not by any kind of ape man at all. So you've got this flint arrowhead solidly embedded in a toxodon bone that's 3 million years old. So this discovery was reported to the scientific world by Carlos Ameghino, who is the brother of Florentino, who had announced the discovery of the human skull from Buenos Aires that was 1.5 million years old. So this discovery was very, very controversial. So, as I said, a lot of scientists, they had problems with this discovery. Couldn't believe that humans existed 3 million years ago. So one of them, Eric Beaumont, who is a prominent scientist from South America, said, here's what happened. Somebody got a 3 million year old toxodon femur, thigh bone. Then that person went to like an old Indian settlement about a couple thousand years old, picked up a flint arrowhead. Then he took that flint arrowhead and he pounded it into the 3 million year old toxodon bone. And then he took the bone with the arrowhead and he planted it in the excavation for Carlos Ameghino to find. I mean, you kind of see you see how this works. So Carlos Ameghino said, all right. So what he did is he said, okay, I would like you and a whole bunch of other scientists to come to this place and you conduct some excavations and see what you find. So they got the leading South American scientists to come to this site at Miramar. They had archaeologists who were expert in judging whether things were made by humans or not. They had geologists who were expert in judging the strata. They had paleontologists who were expert at looking at the animal bones. And they conducted new excavations at this same site. And they were very, very careful. Like Carlos Ameghino, he let the skeptics conduct the excavations. So they started conducting some new excavations, and he said, okay, you very sure nobody's dug anything here or planted anything? And they said, no, this is undisturbed. We can see it's undisturbed strata. So they started digging into the side of the cliff. And they dug about 5 feet into the side of the cliff. And they discovered human artifacts in the layers of solid rock. And they photographed them in place. They always ask for this. Oh, were the artifacts photographed in place? Yes, in this case. And what they found were bola stones. Now, these bola stones are round stones that have a groove carved around the center. And they're a weapon. They can be used for hunting. You know, you tie some of these stones together with a cord or a piece of leather, and you can throw them and catch birds, small mammals, and things like that. It's a weapon that's still used in Argentina today. And according to anthropologists and archaeologists, it's a weapon that's only made and used by humans like us. They don't think any kind of ape man is capable of doing these things. The same layers that the original Toxodon thigh bone with the flint arrowhead were found in, 3 million years old. And this formation here is 3 million years old. Actually, scientists still go there for the animal bones that are found. But what's most interesting from my point of view is not just the animal bones that are found there, but the human tools and the animal bones with flint arrowheads in and things like that show there was a human presence in South America 3 million years ago. And as I said, these discoveries were made in the direct presence of the skeptic who had proposed it was a hoax. Really interesting, well-documented case. You couldn't want a better documented case. The artifacts photographed in place, professional geologists, paleontologists, and archaeologists present, skeptics present. You couldn't want a better documented case for evidence for extreme human antiquity than this. So, anyone have any questions at this point? Yes.
How does stone layer form that covers all those bones?
These are formations. They're called Aeolian foundation formations, which means they were the bones were originally deposited by wind-blown sand and dust in this part of South America. That means, okay, there was like a plain somewhere. Some animals were there, humans were there. The animals died, the human beings left their stone tools. And then over the course of many thousands of years, there's dust blowing, sand blowing, and being laid down, covering it. And then over time, those layers of sand and dust, they turn into rock. So that's what happened here. In some cases, some places it's waterborne deposits. Some places you've got wind deposits like this, and it happens over the course of many thousands of years. So what happened in this case, as I said, was these animals died, the humans left their tools and things, and then gradually they were covered by layers of wind-blown sand that were blowing from the central part of southern South America, from the deserts and things there, dropping these layers of dust and sand on them.
Like Neanderthal and Homo erectus, do they have tools and weapons like that as well?
Archaeologists and anthropologists do not believe they were using bows and arrows and things like that. They believe they may have been using some very, very primitive tools, but not like bola stones, bows and arrows, and things like that. According to their ideas, those things would have been used by humans like us. And practically speaking, that's what we find. I mean, we find even a chimpanzee can take a rock and break open a nut or something like that. Even birds, will use little tools, little sticks and things, or so even animals will sometimes make use of some very, very primitive tools. But for things like bows and arrows, bola stones, most scientists would say practically they'd be unanimous in saying that only humans like us made and used those kinds of things, which may lead, and sometimes people might wonder, well, what about, didn't they have computers in those days, or 3 million years ago? But they might have had computers in those days, but the problem is, say, okay, you're talking about 3 million years ago. All right. Well, what if they did have laptop computers 3 million years ago? Problem is this stuff does not preserve very well because the plastics will dissolve. There are museums today where they've been trying to preserve plastic objects. Because our plastics are about 100 years old, basically, most of them. And they're finding a hard time preserving the earliest plastic objects in museums because they're just turning to dust. They don't last a long time. The metals, most metals will oxidize. So this kind of, a flint arrowhead isn't going to go anywhere. It'll last 3 million years. A laptop computer is not going to last for 3 million years. So they might have had laptop computers 3 million years ago, but so it's not that I'm saying that millions of years ago there were only primitive people using stone tools and stone weapons. It's just the unfortunate fact that the kind of stuff that we consider high tech doesn't preserve very well over many millions of years. There have been some documentaries recently connected with the environmental crisis, and they're based on this idea. What if humans disappeared today? How long would the remains of our civilization last? And the scientists who've studied this question very carefully said not very long. But we may think, but what about these huge cities, with skyscrapers and all this? It seems like very permanent, but actually it's not. I mean, most of our big cities are located either on the ocean or on the banks of rivers. And those rivers are kept in their place by dams, levees, seawalls, things like that. Without human beings to maintain that stuff, the dams will break eventually, the seawalls will break, the levees will, and then the rivers will start flowing as they used to, wherever they want to go, huge floods. We also rely on our fire departments, to kind of like if a fire starts, well, you get all the firemen there, they put it out. If there's no human beings around, the fires are just going to blaze uncontrolled. There would be floods, rivers. We kind of think that concrete is a very permanent substance, but actually it rots. And actually we think, oh, but what about the steel girders? Actually, after some time, they'll start to rust. When steel girders start to rust, they expand. They'll break the concrete off of them. They'll fall down. After several thousands of years, there's not going to be very much left. Well, to speak of after millions of years. So I just wanted to throw that out there because sometimes, yeah.
Regarding a lot of these skeptics that you've come across, in your research, I was wondering if you found any common themes between them with regard to, say, their associations privately, belief systems, etc.
Yes, I do seem to see some common associations because.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, so the question is, sorry, I promised I would and I forgot. Thanks for reminding me. The question is, when I'm looking at the critics and the skeptics that I encounter in my work, do I notice among them any sorts of common themes or associations? And yes, I do note some kind of common themes and associations. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm presenting evidence that contradicts the current theories of human origins. And that means, really, we need to start looking for alternatives. And the alternatives generally involve something non-material. The idea that there is some kind of designer and controller of the universe, that there are powers that go beyond, strictly material forces and things like that. When you start getting into the alternatives, that's what you get into. There's intelligent design, there's creationism, there's the different ancient wisdom traditions, there's subtle powers and things like that. Those are the kinds of things you get into when you get beyond the stones and bones, so to speak. And I think there are a lot of people that in this world who don't want to see things go in that direction. They would rather see things where everybody's sort of working happily, doing their jobs, paying their taxes, consuming, not getting interested in all this other stuff that might distract them from the important business of producing and consuming more and more material things so that governments can collect the tax money, big corporations can collect the profits, scientists can collect their share. So I think there are a lot of forces in the world that just want to keep things in place. The status quo from which a lot of people have learned to profit. And the way they do that is by, keeping people pretty much focused on material production and consumption. And there's a whole system worked out for that, so that if it's even slightly disturbed, then all the governments, everybody gets in a big tizzy. How can we put things back in shape? Because otherwise, if you let people start just doing whatever they want, they're not going to be doing the things that are keeping the political, economic, social, cultural institutions in place. So yeah, I think that's sort of a common theme that I notice. But there's a huge amount that could be said about that, but that's one thing that I notice. Okay. So we'll go on a little bit further back in time now. In 1979, Mary Leakey was a very prominent archaeologist, discovered some footprints at a place called Laetoli in the country of Tanzania in East Africa. And in her original report, which is published in National Geographic magazine, she said, these footprints are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. In other words, they look just like the footprints that you or I would make if we were walking on a beach or in the sand somewhere. Now, that's kind of interesting because the footprints were found in layers of rock 3,700,000 years old, almost 4 million years old. And other scientists also agreed with Mary Leakey. This very famous paleontologist called Tim White. He said, make no mistake about it, they are like modern human footprints. And he said this, and he's quoted in this book, Lucy, which is about a famous ape woman. Lucy, an Australopithecus afarensis. So practically everyone who's looked, every scientist who's looked at these footprints has said they are like modern human footprints, exactly. But now neither Mary Leakey nor Tim White believe that humans like us were present 4 million years ago to make these footprints. So how do they explain the footprints? Oh, it's just another scientist who says they're indistinguishable from modern human footprints. So they say the footprints are exactly like modern human footprints, but they don't believe that humans like us were present 4 million years ago. So what's the explanation? The explanation, they say, is this. 4 million years ago, there must have been some kind of ape people who had feet exactly like modern human feet, and that's how the footprints were made. Now that's an interesting proposal. That would explain it. Unfortunately, there's no physical evidence to support that idea. We have the skeletons of the ape people who lived at that time, 4 million years ago. They're called Australopithecus. And the foot structure of Australopithecus is not like that of a modern human being. It's very ape-like. For example, the big toe moves out to the side like a human thumb, and the other toes are long, sort of like short human fingers. So the foot of Australopithecus is very ape-like. It's not like that of a modern human being at all. Actually, the only creature known to science today that has a foot exactly like that of a modern human being is a human being like us. Now, maybe in the future, maybe somebody will find some ape person that has a foot exactly like a modern human foot, but that has not happened up to this moment in time. The only creature known to science that has a foot just like that of a modern human being is a human being like us. So what did Mary Leakey actually find? I would say she found evidence that humans like us were present 4 million years ago. Now somebody might say, footprints 4 million years ago, but wouldn't it be better if you had human skeletons 4 million years old? That would help your case. And such things do exist. In the 19th century, the Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni found several human skeletons in layers of rock 4 million years old at a place called Castanedolo in northern Italy. And I went to that village in northern Italy a few years ago. to see if I could relocate the site where he made these discoveries. What you saw in the previous picture was the skull of one of those skeletons. So in the village, I met this man, this elderly gentleman, and I gave him a copy of the Italian edition of my book, Forbidden Archaeology, and he gave me, in exchange, a copy of a very rare, out-of-print geological report about these discoveries that were made at Castanedolo. And in this report, there's an exact description of the location where the excavation was made, and from that information we were able to relocate the place, which would be in this area here. So this is part of my work. I try to not only look at the reports, but actually visit the sites, see if I can relocate them, with the idea that that information may help others who could do more research there, reopen the excavations and things like that. So, again, there are skeptics. And they'll say, look, this is very, very easy to explain. There's nothing mysterious about it at all. Maybe a few thousand years ago, somebody died up here. Then his friends dug a grave and put the body down here. And, that's why you think you have found some human skeleton in some very ancient layer of rock. It's very simple. But the discoverer, Ragazzoni, was a professional geologist, and he was very much aware of this problem. And, if you study his original report, as I did in the Italian language, you'll see that he discusses this possibility. He said, okay, if it was a burial, then the layers of rock above the skeleton would have been disturbed, as we see here. At Castanedolo, you've got the 4 million year old layer here, then another layer above it, then another. So if there was a burial from the surface only a few thousand years ago, then all the layers of rock above the skeleton would have been disturbed by the digging of the grave. And he said, I looked very carefully, when I was doing my work, and I could see that all the layers of rock above the skeleton were intact, undisturbed, which means the skeleton really did belong in the place in which it was found. In this case, about 4 million years old. So any questions up to this point? Yes?
Actually, with the Mary Leakey footprint,
Yeah.
if that corresponded with the picture that you showed, how does that work out? If it was if the picture, everything looked not disturbed around it, but there was a footprint. So I'm just wondering how that footprint was found with the rest of the soil not disturbed.
Okay. So the question is, what was the geological situation of the Mary Leakey footprints? They were found in solidified volcanic ash. In other words, what had happened there was a volcano that erupted. It sent up a huge plume of ash, and the ash started coming down. And we see this happens in the world today. It happens in many parts of the world. So these persons, they were walking through the ash, and they were leaving their footprints in the ash. So then later, the ash was in a soft kind of condition. Maybe it was like raining a little bit, so it was like a little mud, volcanic ash mud. So whoever was there that left the footprints was walking through this volcanic ash. And then later, what happened is that the mud solidified, turned into stone. And then what happened, according to the discoverers, is like a river washed over the area and left some mud in the footprints. And then more layers of mud were deposited, and gradually that, over the course of hundreds of thousands of years, turned into kind of sandstone or mudstone. Then later, more river waters washed over and started washing away those deposits. Now the mud that had infilled the volcanic ash layers was softer than the solidified volcanic ash, so that when the new erosion took place, it kind of washed out the infilling, exposing the footprints. Do you have that picture? And then the archaeologists and paleontologists came and they were looking and they saw the footprints. Now, how they determined the age is because they were volcanic deposits. The volcanic deposits could be dated using a method called the potassium-argon method, which is one of these radiometric methods where they have the mineral potassium turns into a gas called argon. The radioactive isotopes of potassium turn into argon gas. And they can measure this, the ratio between the potassium and the argon, and get some age for the ash. And the age that they got was 3,700,000 years. So that's the story of how the footprints were made, covered over. Then they were eroded. The softer material came out first, leaving the footprints exposed. This is practically speaking what happens with, in one way or another, this is what happens with all footprint evidence. That it's originally made in some kind of soft mud or something like that. It hardens to a very hard consistency. Then it gets filled in with some softer sediment. And then later, when there's some erosion, the softer sediments come out first. And then you've got the footprints exposed. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay. So I'll go through this one more. What time are we going to do? Is the lunch at noon?
We can do it now, actually, if you're at a breaking point. We just got it all set out.
When do people want to go to lunch? Whenever? Okay. All right, so let's just do this one more case here, and then we'll ask for some final questions, and then we'll break for lunch, and then at 1 o'clock we'll come back. So now we're going to, I could give you more cases, 4 million years, 5 million years, but we're going to jump a little further back in time. We're going to go fast backward. So this is Carlos Ribeiro, who was the head government geologist of the country of Portugal in the latter part of the 19th century. And he discovered hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Portugal. And he found them in layers of rock that belonged to the early Miocene period, which means they'd be about 20 million years old. And as a professional geologist, he said, they cannot have come down from any higher, more recent level. They really belong in the layers of rock that are 20 million years old. And modern geologists who have studied the geology of Portugal agree that those layers of rock in which these things were found, they still consider them to be about 20 million years old. So Ribeiro displayed the artifacts in these cases here in the Museum of Geology in Lisbon. But if you go to the museum today, you will not see the artifacts here anymore. Today they're kept locked in these cabinets here. And if you were just an ordinary person, you wouldn't even suspect they were there. But a rascal like me, you know, I had done the research. You know, I knew that they were somewhere in the museum. So I went to the museum and I spoke to the director of the museum. I was doing research for a report on these discoveries that I was going to present to a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists. And the European Association of Archaeologists had already accepted my proposal to do the study and present this at their annual meeting. So I had the letter, you know, from the European Association of Archaeologists saying yes, his Michael Cremo's proposal to give a report on these discoveries has been accepted for presentation at our annual meeting. So I was able to give that to the director of the museum, and he said, okay, I'll let you see them and photograph them. If an ordinary person went to the museum, you would never see them. Even if you knew they were there and you asked, you would not be shown them. So I got permission to study and photograph these artifacts. And these are some of the 20 million year old human artifacts from Portugal that were collected originally by Carlos Ribeiro. So they still are there in the museum. And these are some of them. This is one of my assistants taking the pictures. Now, by studying Ribeiro's old maps and field notes, we were able to go out into the countryside of Portugal and relocate some of the sites where these objects were originally discovered. This is the quarry at Morganheira, and these are the early Miocene formations there, and it was here that Ribeiro recovered some of his human artifacts in the layers of rock 20 million years old. And this is one of the artifacts he got there. It's made of flint. It's got a nice point on it. You can even see the use marks. You know, it was being used, you know, for something. You know, like so it's obviously a stone tool that was used by humans 20 million years ago. Now, something interesting happened. As I said, when Ribeiro was alive in the latter part of the 19th century, he displayed these artifacts in the main Museum of Geology in Lisbon with labels indicating an age of 20 million years. They were there. When he died, his colleagues did something interesting. They left the artifacts on display in those cases, but they wrote new labels for all of them, giving them far younger ages. For example, this is the new label they wrote for the artifact I just showed you. And this line gives the age. It says Paleolitico Superior. That means the upper Paleolithic period. Now, according to archaeologists, the upper Paleolithic period in Europe goes back about 20,000 years. So here's what they thought. They thought, 20 million years, that is impossible. That is completely impossible. We can't have that. So they thought, well, 20,000 years, that sounds about right for something like this. So they wrote new labels for all the artifacts, you know, giving them these far younger ages. And then the next generation of officials in the museum in the 1950s just put the whole collection away, new labels and all. They just didn't want to have it as part of the collection of the museum anymore. And I'm, the first researcher to see these artifacts in about 50 years. So as I said, I gave a report on these discoveries at a meeting of the European Association of Archaeologists in the year 2000, and that meeting was held in Lisbon. So it was quite an interesting experience. So I think this is another case, but we're going to hold off on this one until after lunch. I'll just ask if there are any final questions or comments anyone would like to make at this time about any of the discoveries or...
How did they react when you present your findings?
Well, there are...
Write it off?
So the question is how are these facts received when I report them? I think it's very significant that I'm able to report them at these professional meetings. This shows, I believe, that there are some open-minded scientists, because they don't have to accept, the way that I am able to give these reports is I join these scientific associations, like I join the European Association of Archaeologists, and then I receive notice of their conferences. They send me a letter saying we're holding a conference next year in Lisbon, for example, and we're inviting proposals for papers. So I send in a proposal, and I say, okay, I want to give a paper about these discoveries that were made by Carlos Ribeiro showing a human presence in Portugal 20 million years ago. And I want to explain the history of these discoveries. Now, then the proposal goes to a scientific review committee, because they don't accept every proposal that comes. So I thought it was very significant. They accepted my proposal. They were at least interested enough to hear what I had to say. And I think that's a very important first step, that there are some scientists who are open to hearing new evidence that contradicts their ideas. Because I find there are different reactions among the scientific community. There's one group that are very much opposed to what I have to say. They don't want to hear what I have to say. They don't want anyone else to hear it. They're kind of like a minority, but a very kind of influential minority. But then there's this bigger group of scientists who may accept the current theories, but at least they're open-minded enough to consider, well, maybe we're wrong. Maybe there's some, there's some evidence that contradicts our theories, and we should think about it. Then there's the kind of scientists who actually agree with me, and very often they've been victims of this knowledge filtering process. For example, like Virginia Steen McIntyre, for example. So, and I think this is, so there are different reactions, because the scientific world is not all monolithic. They're not all the same. Yes, there are these skeptics and people who are very closed-minded and who don't want to listen to any alternatives. In some cases, they even try to stop my lectures at universities. My books have been translated into 20 languages, for example. One of the languages is Russian. So I was speaking at some Russian universities. In one university, some professors from, they had invited me to come and speak. But at the last minute, the president of the university canceled the lecture. So the professors went to him and said, why did you do it? He'd been pressured. by some of this first group that I was talking about, the extreme skeptics and who don't want to hear me, don't want anybody else to hear me. And so the professors went to him and said, why are you doing this? We should have academic freedom here. We should. And he said, no, he's not going to speak here. So then these professors went to the local branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, which is actually a little bit higher in the hierarchy, in the scientific world. And they explained the situation to the director. And he said, Mr. Cremo could speak here. And nobody's going to put any pressure on me. He'll speak here. So the lecture was arranged for me to speak at the local branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, which is a very prestigious organization. And they arranged for buses to take students and professors from the university to come to the lecture off the campus. And actually the professors told me more people came to the lecture than would have come if it had been held at the university itself. Because he said everybody in the university was talking. Who is this guy? Why are they banning him? What has he got to say? So it sort of backfired on them. So this was a couple of years ago. I went back to the same university last fall, and I was invited to speak at the biology department there, and they didn't try to cancel the lecture. I guess they learned their lesson. So better just let me speak.
Must have been the same time as our conference last year. You were double booked or whatever, and you were over in Russia.
That's right. Yeah, I think I was last fall. Yeah, October, November, December, I was in Russia. So this is what I find is, yes, there's this group that's very much opposed. There's a small group that is very much in favor, kind of like the victims of the knowledge filtering process. But then there are these scientists who are kind of in the middle, who support the current theories because as far as they know, that's the best science is able to do, but they're open-minded enough to hear what I have to say. So that's kind of the experience that I had in Lisbon, and I very often am invited to present papers at these big international conferences on archaeology and anthropology. Okay, welcome back. Hope you had a nice lunch. So we were at about 20 million years. So we're going to go back a little bit further in time. This is the Belgian geologist Routot. And he discovered hundreds of human artifacts in his country of Belgium. He found them in layers of rock about 30 million years old from the Oligocene period. By studying some of his old papers in the Royal Museum of Natural Sciences in Brussels, I was able to relocate some of the sites where he made these discoveries. This is the quarry at Boncel in Belgium, where Routot made some of his discoveries in the early 20th century. He discovered human artifacts in the bottom layers of this quarry in Oligocene formation. So the Oligocene period goes back over 30 million years. His artifacts are still in the collection of the Royal Museum of Natural Sciences in Brussels. Of course, if you went to the museum, you would never see them. This is my assistant taking some photographs. This is an archaeology student in Europe who helps me out with my work there. She's taking photographs of some of the artifacts. Um, it's sort of interesting what happened when Routot was alive. He displayed the artifacts in this museum, the Royal Museum of Natural Sciences in Brussels, with labels indicating an age of 30 million years. Now, after he died, his colleagues in the museum decided, well, we can't have this in our museum. So they removed the collection from display, and they destroyed a lot of the original documentation that went along with the collection. But the artifacts themselves are still there in the museum collection. As I said, they're not shown to the public. You wouldn't even know they were there if you went yourself. You would have to be someone like me that has dug into the history and knows a little bit about these things. So I had gotten permission from an international congress on the history of science to present a paper about these discoveries. So what I did, again, it's very hard to get access to these things. So what I did is I went to the director of the museum, showed him that I had a letter from a major international scientific conference giving me permission to present a paper about these discoveries, the history of these discoveries, at that conference. So he could kind of see, okay, this is not in what in his mind would be, considered some sensationalistic type of person, although I don't shy away from sensationalism. But he could see, okay, he's got permission from this scientific conference to present the paper. He's going through the proper channels to try to get permission. So, all right, he gave me permission to study and photograph the artifacts. The archaeologists working up there, they said, boy, why do you want to see these? This everybody knows this stuff can't possibly be. I said, well, I'm just looking at the history of these things. As far as I'm concerned, I can see no reason to doubt at all that they're as old as Routot said they were. So the artifacts are there. I was able to study and photograph them. But as I said, the average person wouldn't even know they were there, let alone be able to get permission to see them. Now, a case I've always found extremely fascinating is the California gold mine discoveries. Now, in the gold rush days, gold was discovered, California. Miners from around the world came there to get the gold. And to get the gold, they were digging tunnels into the sides of mountains. This is Table Mountain in Tuolumne County in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California near Sonora. It's one of the many places where these mining activities were going on. And deep inside the tunnels in the solid rock, the miners found human bones and human artifacts. For example, they found many of these stone mortars and pestles there. Now, according to archaeologists, these are the kinds of things that would not have been made by any kind of ape man. They're considered to be very advanced stone tools of the kind made only by humans. And they figure normally they would say they would be less than 10,000 years old. But these human bones and human artifacts were found in some very ancient layers. This particular one For example, there's a stone hatchet that a man named James Carvin found at Table Mountain. Said the above relic was found about 60 to 75 feet from the surface in gravel under the basalt, about 300 feet from the mouth of the tunnel. There were also some mortars found at about the same time and place. There are many reports like this of the miners finding these things. Llewellyn Pierce on a stone mortar found in the Boston Tunnel Company mine. It's described as dug up by me about the year 1862 under Table Mountain in gravel at a depth of about 200 feet from the surface under the basalt, which was over 60 feet deep and about 1,800 feet in from the mouth of the tunnel. In other words, like a tunnel was drilled into the side of this mountain. He went 1,800 feet inside the tunnel. Above these layers were solid layers of volcanic deposits, basalt deposits. So it was underneath these basalt deposits in the gold-bearing gravels, the auriferous gravels as they're called, that he found these human artifacts. They also found, as I said, human bones. This is one of the pieces of a skull that was found in these gold mines is now in the collection of the Museum of the Natural History Society of Boston. It's a skull fragment, anatomically modern human skull fragment that came from a shaft in Table Mountain, 180 feet below the surface in gold drift, overlying strata of basaltic compactness and hardness, found July 1857. In other words, this is another case where they went in, mine, in the solid rock, they find a human bone, and above it is hundreds of feet of solid lava. J.H. Neal, supervisor, Montezuma Tunnel Mine. At a distance of between 1,400 and 1,500 feet from the mouth of the tunnel, or between 200 and 300 feet below the edge of the solid lava, Mr. Neal found a small mortar. He also found a large, well-formed pestle. That's this mortar and pestle here. 1869, Clarence King, U.S. Geological Survey, found at Table Mountain a pestle in gold-bearing gravel beneath the latite. Latite is another name for a type of lava. The geologist George Becker said Mr. King is perfectly sure that this implement was in place and that it formed an original part of these gold-bearing gravels. So we might wonder how old these gold-bearing gravels are. They date back to the early part of the geological period called the Eocene, which means they'd be about 50 million years old. So here we've got numerous reports of hundreds of stone tools and artifacts and human bones being found in layers of rock 50 million years old. It's really quite extraordinary. So here's a little more information about the dating of these discoveries. This again is Table Mountain, which is one of the places where these objects were discovered. This is the Montezuma Tunnel mine that goes in here. So what we have here are some ancient river channels which were filled with sediments and gravel that are now hard like rock. Like you make cement. You mix sand and gravel and everything, it turns hard. So then what happened was, after about 30 million years, there were hundreds of feet of volcanic deposits that covered those ancient river channels. And these have been dated using the potassium-argon method as being up to 33 million years old. But now down here in these ancient river deposits are plant and animal fossils that are characteristic of the early Eocene period. And it's in those deposits that the human bones and the human artifacts were found. I mean, what happened afterwards is that originally this whole area was covered. My little batteries are running out for this pointer. But this whole area on top was covered with solid lava. And then on either side, there were rivers that started to flow later and cut these little canyons down on the side so that you wind up with like a mesa sort of thing. But this is where the human bones and the human artifacts were found over 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 feet inside the tunnel, drilled through the solid rock in these very ancient deposits. Yes?
Now, how do scientists explain that?
They don't have any good explanation. They'd rather just forget about it.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, so the question is, well, how do scientists who are maybe a little bit skeptical about this explain the presence of these artifacts in these very ancient layers of rock? They will give a list of possibilities, saying, well, they must have slipped down through some fissure. Well, I think anything is possible. I was once speaking to a scientist who raised an objection like this. I was lecturing at a university in Denmark. Not a university. I was lecturing. It was a public lecture, but an archaeologist from the university had come there. And after I gave the talk, he raised a question. He says, well, couldn't these artifacts have fallen down through fissures into those very ancient layers? And I said, well, anything is possible. It's possible that you're a Martian robot that's been programmed to say that. Can you prove that you're not a Martian robot? Because you can always do this. You can always give some possible explanation. But I said, if you're going to be really scientific about it, then you would have to demonstrate that that exact location, a fissure actually does exist, and that there are artifacts on the surface there that could fall down through that fissure into those very ancient layers of rock. You can't just raise possibilities. Anybody can do that. Just like if you're some parents, want to keep their child out of the closet where the Christmas presents are hidden. You might say, don't go in that closet, there's a ghost in there. If I were the kid, I'd go look and see if there was a ghost. I wouldn't just be afraid because of some scary story somebody tells me, which is what these guys try to do. They just try to give some story, how possibly, the evidence could be wrong. But you could do that with any evidence. You could do it with the evidence that supports the current theories. You could say, well, yeah, something's wrong with that, possibly. So that's the usual type of explanation. Another type of explanation was, well, maybe some Indians carried these artifacts into the mines. And two things wrong with that. The current Indians don't use portable mortars and pestles. They use, like they're big pieces of rock, where they just grind things. You can find that in a lot of areas where you've got solid pieces of rock that have worn places in them where they would do the grinding and things like that. Plus, unfortunately, they had been driven out of this area. They wouldn't have gone anywhere near there. Unfortunately, I have to say. because they would have been treated very badly if they had wandered into any of those mines. Miners are very protective of their mines, and they don't want strange people walking into them. So that's another, counter explanation that they would give. And I don't find them very convincing. Of course, everybody can make up their own minds about these things, but for me, I don't think those kinds of objections carry very much weight, especially when you have people like Mr. Neal, who was the chief mining engineer of the mine, testifying that he looked for any fissures or stuff where it could have come down. And he said these things were solidly embedded in the rock. It had to be chipped out. I mean, they're not just things that somebody carried in there or slipped down through some fissure. So when I looked at all the testimony, I could see that the kinds of theoretical objections that some skeptical scientists who would have a hard time believing that humans were present 50 million years ago would make, I would see that those kinds of objections were being raised not because there's any real evidence for them, but simply because they're just grabbing at straws, trying to come up with any possibilities that could explain away the evidence. So as I said, this is a little information about how the dating is arrived at. And these discoveries were reported to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. He was educated at Harvard. Mount Whitney is named after him. So we're not talking about a marginal person reporting these discoveries. We're talking about one of America's most prominent scientists at the time. And his report about these discoveries was published by Harvard University in an official scientific publication. It's very good evidence, I think, but we don't hear very much about these discoveries today through the official channels because of the process of knowledge filtration that I mentioned. And this is the scientist most responsible for the knowledge filtering in this particular case. This is Dr. William Holmes, who is an anthropologist working at the Smithsonian Institution. And he said, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he would not have announced those discoveries, despite the imposing array of testimony with which he was confronted. Now let me translate that into plain English. If the facts don't fit the theory, the facts have to be put aside and forgotten. And that's exactly what happened. But as I mentioned a little earlier, I had my own experience of the knowledge filtering process in connection with these California gold mine discoveries. When I was a consultant for the television program, Mysterious Origins of Man. Do you have some of those? Yeah. Do you have some of those here? Yeah. So there's a DVD of this television program, but it's not just the program, it's all the complete interviews with myself and Richard Thompson. They just put some of it into the show. But this recently released DVD that they put out has the complete interviews with myself and Richard Thompson, a much younger me. You want to see what I looked like when I was in my 40s? You can have a look at that. So I told the producer, Bill Cote, that he should go. Oh, the show was hosted by Charlton Heston. That was it was kind of interesting to have him there speaking. So I told Bill Cote he should go to the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, because I knew that some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the collection of that museum. So he went there, and the museum officials gave him all kinds of excuses. First thing they said was, well, you're making a television program, you probably have a very tight deadline. We just wouldn't have the time to have our staff go hunting through our collections for these artifacts and bring them out to show you. So Bill Cote told them, no, I've got 6 months, to do the program. Could you please have a look? And then they said, well, we have another problem. This is not the normal work of our staff. We would have to pay them overtime to do it. We have a very small budget, and we just don't have the money to do it. So Bill Cote said, I'll pay the expenses. I'll pay the overtime salaries for the workers. And then they just said, no. You're not going to see them. Now, despite that, we were able to find some photographs of the artifacts that Whitney had taken in the 19th century. So we were able to use those for the show. So the show did go on. And there was a huge reaction from scientists here in the United States. They were absolutely outraged that a major American television network, NBC, would show to the American people on Sunday evening, which is the time when most people watch television. It's prime time, the highest prime time, when many young children would still be up and hear something that directly contradicted they were being told in the schools. They were just absolutely outraged that NBC would do something like this. Actually, they tried to stop NBC from showing the program when they learned about it. They weren't successful. NBC did show the program, and it was so popular they decided to show it again a second time. When these scientists found out that NBC was going to show it a second time, they became even more outraged. And they tried to organize a letter campaign on the internet, getting scientists from all over the world to write to the president of the General Electric Company, which owns NBC, saying, you have to tell NBC not to show this program again. That didn't work either. Actually, NBC did show it again, and they made publicity ahead of time saying, watch the program the scientists don't want you to see. So this made this group of scientists even more angry. So then they went to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and they wanted the FCC to investigate NBC, censure NBC. They wanted the FCC to force NBC to broadcast primetime apologies for having shown the program. And they also wanted the FCC to fine NBC millions of dollars. So they would never do anything like this again. Now, I'm happy to say the FCC didn't do that. But I find it very interesting that these kinds of attempts were made. It just shows how these scientists, they want a monopoly, not only in the education system, but in the media, so that only their message gets through. Now, they could just as well have put on their own television program saying, okay, they could go on Nova or one of these programs on PBS, and they could have done a little documentary. Yes, NBC said this on their television program, and we think it's wrong for this reason. But no, that isn't what they tried to do. They tried to silence, the messenger, which I think is a kind of a dangerous kind of tendency. Yes.
I don't understand what is the motivation. What do they hope to get out of hiding all the information from the public?
Okay.
You'd think as a scientist they want to get on the bandwagon. Wow, look at these new facts.
Well, see, the problem is that this evidence contradicts one of their most fundamental theories, the theory of evolution, which for many scientists is more than a scientific theory. It's like an ideology. You know, it's something you cannot possibly doubt and still call yourself a scientist. And I think there's a lot of motivations there. Part of it has to do with just human nature. For example, if I love somebody, and then somebody tells me something bad about the person I love, I don't want to believe it. I may even become very angry at the person who tells me. Say, no, my girlfriend would never do anything like that, or my boyfriend would never do anything. It would take, you know, there's just such an emotional attachment there that you can't believe something that goes against what you deeply believe to be true about a person or a theory. So today, many scientists are very much in love with this theory of evolution that they have. Just like this is the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth. So all around the world, you know, scientists are celebrating. You know, yes, we love Darwin, we love him, we love his theory. And anybody who dares to contradict it or doubt it somehow becomes public enemy number one. So there's this emotional attachment that's there. And then beyond that, there's a question, and see, this is also something that I documented in a book that I wrote called Forbidden Archaeology's Impact. Because people would often ask me, well, what do scientists think about your work and this? So I put a book together about that, giving all the reactions, and I included in it a lot of the internet traffic that scientists were exchanging among themselves after this TV program came out. And they were concerned about two things. So I think there's some other reasons. As I said, I've documented in my book, Forbidden Archaeology's Impact, the internet traffic that was going back and forth among scientists on scientific discussion groups after this program was aired. And they expressed two concerns. One was research money. They say, our research money is coming from Congress. It's coming from the representatives of the American people. If big television networks like NBC are putting out these messages to the American people that contradict our theory, they may eventually go to their political representatives and say, why are we giving all these millions of dollars to these guys who are promoting this theory that really doesn't hold up against the evidence? They might say that. Their internet messages are documented in the book there. And the other thing they were concerned about was their monopoly in the education system. They say, okay, we've got a monopoly in the education system. Only our theory can be taught in the schools. But when the kids go home and they turn on television and see somebody like Charlton Heston, a respected person, on a respected television network, NBC, broadcasting in prime time, a message that contradicts what we're telling them in the schools, it's just a waste. You know, it's working against everything we're trying to accomplish in the education system. So that was another factor. And so I think on a certain level it has to do with power. You know, there are different kinds of power in the world. There's military power, there's political power, there's economic power, there's also intellectual power. And we see that those who have power, monopoly power especially, don't like to give it up. Say if one political party has a monopoly on the political life of a country or city or state, doesn't want to give up its position, perfectly natural. if there's a corporation that has a monopoly in a particular sector of the economy, computer software, automobiles, whatever, they don't want to give up their position. Perfectly natural. If there's a group of scientists who has monopoly power in the education system, where only their ideas get taught, there's no competition, no alternatives allowed, certainly it's perfectly natural that they would want to keep that position. So I think there are a lot of different motives that underlie the resistance to having these messages communicated through the media or through the education system or things like that. So I would just like to see a little, normally we wouldn't tolerate the government, telling us you can only buy one kind of car, or you can only watch one television station or listen to one radio show. Normally, we wouldn't tolerate the government telling us that. We think, no, we're Americans. We like freedom of choice, freedom of thought, freedom of expression. But at the present moment, we are tolerating the government telling us only one idea about the origin of life can be taught in the education systems. I just think there are alternatives. It's not true that all scientists accept the current theories. There's some who don't. So I just think the alternatives should be represented in the education system. Let people make up their own minds about these things without, scientists trying to get the government to punish media who present alternative ideas, or some people in some particular state, they want to get some alternatives in the education system. They come down through the federal courts to try to block those efforts. I think we should have more. I'm not saying that theory of evolution should be eliminated from the let it stay there. If somebody wants to believe it, let them believe it. If they want to teach it, let them teach it. But they shouldn't have a government-enforced monopoly in the education system. Are there others who want to teach other things? Let them teach that. So, the story doesn't end there. A couple of years ago, I went back to the museum myself because I had gotten a proposal to present a paper about these discoveries at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress, which is the world's largest international organization of archaeologists. So I went to the museum, and it's quite a complicated process. The first thing I had to do is I had to make an appointment to go to the museum, and identify in their catalogs the exact objects that I wanted to see. So any ordinary person wouldn't really know how to do that. You really have to know what you're doing. You have to know the exact place of discovery, the exact date, the name of the discoverer, everything. So because I had all that information from my research, I was able to go into the catalogs of the museum and identify the artifacts that I wanted to see. So I had to fly to Berkeley, I had to fly to San Francisco to keep that appointment, to go through the catalogs. And then after that, I had to present a formal research request to the museum, which they could deny because they have an academic review process. But because I had the proposal to present the paper at the meeting of the World Archaeological Congress, and I had presented the proposal, my research proposal, to the museum in a kind of respectful way that followed their procedures. They did give me permission to come and see and photograph the artifacts on a specific day at a specific time, a few months in advance. So then I had to show up at the museum at that specific time, and it was taken by, I had a photographer with me, and we were kind of taken by a museum official to the place where these artifacts were kept, which is not in the museum itself, but in a storage facility several miles from the museum. And very high security. You have to have all these swipe cards and things to get through, the different gates and clearances and things like that. And like I said, it's this idea, like in Raiders of the Lost Ark and other, that there's secret stuff. It's not just Hollywood. There is stuff in there. So I had to be accompanied by a museum official every step of the way, and we were allowed, so I was allowed into that storage facility where these artifacts are kept, and these are some of the 50-million-year-old human artifacts from the California gold mines. They are still there. And this is like my documentation, the list of the artifacts, their numbers in the collection and stuff like that. And then by studying very carefully Dr. Whitney's original field notes and maps and things like that, I decided to go out into the Sierra Nevada mountains and relocate some of the places where these discoveries were actually made. So this is Table Mountain as it looks today. I'd showed you that before. This is where some of the discoveries were made at mines in Table Mountain. It's on government land. Here you can see the solid volcanic deposits on top, and the mines were down at this level going in. And this is, you can recognize Lori there, here, and this is my European archaeologist assistant, who was the official photographer. So we were actually able to relocate some of the old 19th century gold mining tunnels where these things were originally discovered. And it should be possible to do some more research there, see what else might be found. So any questions at this point about the California gold mine discoveries?
I probably missed it. Were they stone artifacts?
Yes, stone artifacts. There were stone mortars and pestles. There were also human skeletal remains found. Some of which are, like, for example, I mentioned a skull fragment that is now in a museum of natural history in Boston. It's kind of on my list of things to do, to go to that museum and kind of track that down. And then they also had obsidian spear points and things like that came from these California gold mines. And altogether, we're talking about hundreds of artifacts, and the reports are in the scientific report by Dr. Whitney that was published by Harvard University. All the details are given there, but it sort of just disappeared from view. Anything else? Yes?
Are they caved in?
That particular tunnel, which... the question is, I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. The question is, are these California gold mine tunnels caved in? The two that we relocated are not caved in, apparently, but when you go in a little ways, they're filled with water, which means that in order to reinvestigate, they're on government land, which means you'd have to have some professional archaeologists agree to make a research proposal. And then if they were actually going to be able to do anything, then you'd have to have equipment to pump out the mines. And then if you were to actually go in there, you'd have to work very carefully to shore up. There's kind of strict rules about how to do these things. And it winds up costing, quite a bit of money, which means there'd have to be somebody that'd be willing to spend quite a bit of money. At one point, I did have an offer from someone in England to fund, some research there, but eventually it became obvious that it was going to cost too much even for this person to be able to fund, to do this kind of the research that would be necessary to go back in there, pump out the mines, shore them up, and then do further digging. So the two mines that we were able to relocate were not collapsed, but they are full of water when you go beyond the entrance. Anything else? Okay. So we'll just a couple more things. We're going to be winding up here pretty quickly. Most of the discoveries I've talked about so far were either made by professional scientists or reported in the professional scientific literature. But if this kind of evidence really is there in the layers of the ground, then we should expect that not just scientists should be finding it, but ordinary people should be finding this kind of evidence. In their reports, although they may not be found in the scientific literature, may be found in other kinds of literature like ordinary newspapers, for example. It's something we should predict should be happening. And it actually does happen. This is a very interesting case here. This is from the Morrisonville Times, from Morrisonville, Illinois. It tells of a woman who, this is from the year 1892, and it tells of a woman who was, a Mrs. Culp, who was putting a big piece of coal into her coal-burning stove. The piece of coal broke open, and inside there was a gold chain about 10 inches long. Now, from this report, we could tell what mine the coal came from. So we did a little bit of research with the Geological Survey of the state of Illinois, and we asked them, well, how old is the coal in this mine? And they said about 300 million years. That's from before the time of the dinosaurs even. So that's really pretty interesting. Now, if we go back to the scientific literature, there's a case that was published in a scientific journal called The Geologist in the year 1862. It told of an anatomically modern human skeleton that was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground in the state of Illinois, in Macoupin County, Illinois. And above the skeleton was a thick layer of slate rock that was unbroken. And that's an important detail. And we asked the geologist of the State Geological Survey of Illinois again, how old is the layer here? I mean, this is just an artist's reconstruction of it. This is just to give you an idea of what the situation was. We asked them, how old is the layer at this place below the slate rock? And they said, again, about 300 million years. Of course, we didn't tell them what was found there, because then they usually refuse to answer your letter. So without mentioning the human skeleton, we just said, okay, at this place, at this depth, beneath the layer of slate rock in Illinois, how old is the formation? And they said about 300 million years. So that's kind of interesting because it's the same age as the gold chain found in the same state at, again, about 300 million years. Now, this interesting report from Scientific American tells of a beautiful metallic vase that was found, let's see, 15 feet below the surface in solid rock as workers were excavating a foundation for a building. And we got in touch with the United States Geological Survey, and we asked them, well, what is the age of this formation at this place at depth of 15 feet? It's called Pudding Stone. Oh, they said, oh, the Pudding Stone at Dorchester at that depth is from the Cambrian period, about 600 million years old. So that's pretty amazing. And finally, some people ask me about the oldest objects I encountered in my research. They come from South Africa. They're these round metallic objects. I call them metallic because they're made out of a kind of naturally occurring iron ore called hematite. You can buy hematite jewelry, for example. It's considered a semi-precious stone. Now, these objects are not big like this. They're about 1 or 2 inches in diameter. The most interesting feature is the parallel grooves that go around the center of each object. And these were found by miners at a place called Ottosdal in the western Transvaal region of South Africa. And these objects are found solidly embedded in layers of rock over 2 billion years old. Now, these objects were shown on that NBC television special, Mysterious Origins of Man. And before NBC agreed to show them, they said, you have to give these objects to an independent company of metallurgists to examine. So that was done. These objects were submitted to an independent company of metallurgists in the United States, and they examined them. And they said they could not find any natural explanation for how these grooves could have formed on these objects, because that's the obvious answer. Somehow or other, yes, down in the layers of the earth, these grooves formed. And this company of metallurgists said, no, we cannot give any possible natural explanation how those grooves could have formed on those objects, which means they had to have been made by someone with human-like intelligence over 2 billion years ago on this planet. So, I could actually keep you here from now until Christmas, going through one case after another, because there are just hundreds of them. I mean, we're not just talking about a few cases. I just wanted to give you a little sample of the kind of evidence that there is for extreme human antiquity. So I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to keep you here until Christmas. But I'll ask you to remember one thing. I mean, there are some scientists who say that all the physical evidence supports this evolutionary picture of human origins, with humans like us coming into existence only about 100 or 200,000 years ago. It's not true that all the physical evidence supports that idea. When we actually look at all the evidence, and not just what we see in today's current textbooks, we find a continuous chain of discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, human footprints, going back many millions of years, all the way back to the very beginnings of the history of life on Earth, which I think is pretty amazing. So, I thank you very much for your kind attention. And yes, we'll have some questions. Yes, please.
I had a question about the couple of pictures ago about the skeleton.
Yeah.
Do you know the dimensions?
It was described in the report as an adult human skeleton. It didn't give the height in the report in the geologist. It said doctors were present, medical doctors were present, who identified it as an anatomically modern human skeleton. And also the geological report was there that it was found 90 feet below the surface of the ground, below a thick layer of slate rock that extended for hundreds of yards in all directions, completely sealing the skeleton off from the surface. And as I said, that's an important detail, because the usual kind of skeptical proposal is that there must have been some fissure through which the skeleton slipped down and got into that very ancient level. Well, the testimony that there was a thick layer of slate rock that was unbroken above the skeleton would tend to rule that out.
Could have been beamed there, right?
Yes, this is another possibility. But if we want to go that way, then I'd be just as happy to go that way. Yeah. See, one thing I did, I just want to say, relative to that, in this book, I simply presented the facts as I could, and I didn't ignore the skeptical objections. If there were some skeptical objections that scientists made, I put them in there. So anybody who reads this book can make up their own minds about these discoveries. In my opinion, they tend to be genuine discoveries, even taking into account the different kinds of objections that could be made. But then it becomes a question, well, how do you explain them? Again, I wanted to leave that up to the readers, because some people have tried to explain this evidence in terms of time travelers. That's one possibility people have raised. Some people have proposed new theories of evolution where the humans come from, in far earlier periods of time than the current theory allows. Other people have proposed extraterrestrial visitations and things like that to explain the evidence. There are people like myself who just prefer to think there were ancient human civilizations at that time. But I wanted people to be free to think about these things. I think it's a really healthy thing. I think one thing that's clear is that what we're being told today isn't the real story. What is the real story? Well, let's talk about that. If you really think they were beamed down there, then great, Yes, sir.
How long ago did the one landmass break up into the 7 continents? General theory, and are there alternative theories?
Well, this theory, was first proposed in the 1920s, and it wasn't widely accepted, this continental breakup, continental drift theory, because at that time scientists really didn't have a mechanism to explain how it could happen. Some scientists now propose they do have a mechanism. They say in the crust of the Earth, there are convection currents that kind of go like this, and there's these thermal convection currents that push things apart and move them around and things like that. There are, however, some scientists today who say that even that really doesn't provide enough energy to explain what's really would have to have gone on to explain that. I've spoken to geologists who say that. But it is the mainstream academic theory today, that originally there was one continent, Pangaea, that broke up, and then by these convection currents in the Earth's mantle, these plates, tectonic plates they're called, that have the continents on them are moving around, going one under the other. And
the whole idea of North America, Central America, and South America being attached to Europe, the Mediterranean, and Africa.
Yeah, it was
There
all.
does seem to be a geographical lineation where one could fit into
Mm-hmm.
the other. But my question really has to do with how long ago is the general theory that happened?
I'm not exactly
Millions of
sure.
years?
Oh, it would be a long time since. I mean, you'd have to go back to, like around the time of the dinosaurs, and a little bit before that, that's when they believed that the continents started breaking up, and
How
they
many
started
million
moving
years ago
apart.
are we talking about? 300?
You're talking several hundred million years, yeah.
Several hundred million years.
They
when
started-
Archaea broke up into 7 continents.
Yeah.
Are there alternative theories that widely differ?
There.
That seems to be the most interesting part of your presentation today, is the alternative theories.
Yeah, I haven't really looked deeply into that myself. I'd have to say I've just kind of concentrated. I mean, my main work is in
I understand.
archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity, but I do have an interest in alternative theories. There are some people. I mean, if you look at the whole history of geology, there's some interesting proposals. Do we have a marker for this? We have a nice thing here. I mean, see, this is not my real field, so I can't speak with a lot of authority about it.
Several hundred million years ago, it gives me a ballpark anyway.
Yeah. But you're talking about alternative theories.
Well,
Yeah, okay. So about alternative, do you mean alternative theories about the
time
arrangement?
period when that might have occurred.
Oh, okay. No, I think they're pretty much agreed.
About 300 million years ago is what.
Hundreds of millions. I can't say. It might be 6, 7, something like that. But, I thought you were maybe talking about alternative theories about, oh boy, let's see, here we go. What explains the arrangement of the continents?
Yes, well,
Because I've read some reports by some geologists that there appear to be some very interesting symmetries.
hey, that's good.
This is like some people find that very hard to explain just by some continent breaking up. Why would it take this symmetrical arrangement?
Yes.
That's what I thought you were talking about.
That's fascinating. It was the age that I was primarily.
I mean, I haven't looked at it lately, so I can't, the exact figure, but it's, there's,
Hundreds of millions of years.
yes, hundreds of millions of years, the continent would have broken up. More like 500 to 600 million years ago, it started breaking up. But again, like I said, I can't really bring it right up to mind like
Well,
I
that's better
can
than
other
50,000 years ago.
yeah.
Right, thank you.
Okay. Yes.
So over these long periods of time, you're talking 2 billion years old, 6 million years old, 300 million years old, there seems to be a time when the art was very elaborate, like gold chains and golden metallic
Yeah.
vessels. And then you find periods of stone ware and periods like that stacked one on top of each other, or what's the explanation?
Consider it
Elaborate.
Okay. So the question is, what is like the pattern of the evidence over these many millions or hundreds of millions of years? Sometimes it appears there's more advanced sort of things, sometimes more simple and primitive sorts of things. Your question relates to levels of human culture. But if we're going to have levels of human culture, think the first thing we have to establish is that human beings were present, during these vast periods of time. And I regard what I've done as just the beginning of this kind of research. I think I've shown at least humans have been present for these vast periods of time. I think the questions related to their levels of culture over these vast periods of time is something for further research. And I think one thing that I've tried to do in my work is kind of open the minds of a whole new generation of researchers and scholars so that they start trying to do the research that would be necessary to really answer your question. I think what they would find is a cyclical pattern where civilizations rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall. This is what the ancient Greek philosophers said, like Plato and Aristotle. They said the civilizations, human civilizations, have risen and fallen many times in the history of the earth. A lot of the great wisdom traditions, they have cyclical patterns of time. It's not that it's just a progression where everything is going up, 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 up. There's cycles where things go up, things go down. So I think what I would predict would be that if a new generation of researchers went out and used what I've done as a foundation, you could start trying to answer these questions in a more systematic way by doing the research that's necessary to do it. What I've done is I've just gone through the research results that are already there and shown that humans have been present for these vast periods of time. And another thing we have to consider is what I was talking about earlier in response to your question, is that a lot of things don't necessarily preserve. For example, why is the gold chain preserved? Gold doesn't oxidize. That's why we consider gold to be valuable. It's one of the reasons why we consider gold to be valuable. It doesn't oxidize. Like iron will oxidize. That means it'll decay. It's one reason why we consider gold to be valuable. And maybe that's one reason why from some ancient times we have gold artifacts, but maybe not computers or jet airplanes or UFOs, because they're made of things that don't preserve very well over those vast periods of time. But another thing to consider is there are two kinds of evidence for what went on in the past. One is the kind of evidence that we can find in the layers of the ground. The other kind of evidence is what the ancient people left to us in their historical records. For example, the ancient Sanskrit writings of India tell of spaceships, they're called vimanas, that existed millions of years ago, in which people would travel from planet to planet. And not only from planet to planet, but interdimensionally, from dimension to dimension in the cosmos. And these ancient Sanskrit writings also speak of weapons that resemble modern nuclear weapons. The American atomic bomb program was headed by a physicist named Robert Oppenheimer, who was also a student of the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. And when he saw the first atomic bomb go off at Alamogordo, the first atomic weapon go off, it had a light just like millions of suns. And there's a description like that in some of the ancient Sanskrit writings. It speaks of a weapon that when it went off had a light as brilliant as millions of suns. So he quoted that. When he saw the atomic bomb first go off, he quoted something from the ancient Sanskrit writings. This weapon is called a Brahmastra. These ancient Sanskrit writings explain how to calculate time from the movement of atoms. We've just had that recently. Now you can buy atomic clocks, that calculate time according to the movement of atoms. These things were known thousands of years ago by these civilizations. So, and it's also true in the accounts of other civilizations. They describe things that appear to be very mystical and mythological even, but may be signs of advanced technologies of civilizations that rose to a certain level and then maybe went through a downturn, and then we see that life is like this. The economy goes up and down, political fortunes go up and down, everything goes up and down. I think history also does that. Radio waves do it. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a serious point that a lot of scientists notice in everything. There are periodicities, there are cycles. So I would say that if we had a new generation of researchers with minds open to these possibilities of a very long human presence on Earth, if they were to go out and start doing more research to find out the exact levels of culture, they would see a pattern like that. Thank you. Very nice question. Yes.
What would you say would be the most extreme form of censorship that you encountered, and was there ever a time when you were like, okay, like your life being threatened, or you're like, okay, forget this, I'm going to stop researching this controversial stuff? Because that's what happens to a lot of people that start getting into stuff that people don't want you to talk about.
Yeah. Yes. These days, okay, question is, have I ever felt personally threatened in my research in such a way that would make me want to give it up? And, the answer is no. I mean, the question is what is the most extreme type of opposition that I've encountered? And I would say these days, the tendency is to try not to literally kill somebody, but to marginalize the person, make their ideas marginal. And, I can find examples of that. I gave examples in some of my talks, in some of my answers to other questions about how sometimes people have tried to stop my lectures, or they've tried to prevent me from speaking, but I'm not inviting these things, of course, but I haven't had any death threats, for example. Nobody has physically attacked me. I think such things do happen, but the way things go in this current age, I think the attempt is more to marginalize a person with different ideas and make them seem disreputable in some way. Yes, that sort of thing is there. I do think that, and this doesn't just affect me, I do think there are systematic attempts to keep alternative ideas out of the mainstream education system. I think that's the key to power in the world today, is control over the education system. Yes?
Normally it takes funding for research. Do you have proponents that support you in your research? And if you do, you have
Yes.
opposition to it. But in turn, do you have people that will say, yes, Michael, go out and do this research and we'll fund you and
If there's anybody like that. Now, fortunately, the sales of my books are enough to, it's just enough, it's like air, enough to breathe. It's enough that I'm able to do what I need to do and go where I need to go. There are, of course, I'm not alone in this work. There are many people working in alternative science, alternative history. There are some organizational supports for some of them. I just really haven't found it necessary because usually with support there comes ties, there comes agendas. So at this point, I'm a little content, you could say, to be operating on my own resources. I'm able to do what I need to do. It's not that I would turn down offers for support, but I would want to be very careful to see what strings there might be
You're right,
there.
strings.
Conditions.
Yeah. Yes?
Okay, I can see there's a lot of scientists that have a lot of problems, like, let's say, believing in these old artifacts, that they're so old. What about, how do I feel about these ancient cities, ancient walls that's been built in ways that only now with our modern technology we can actually build a wall exactly like that. And in those days, they weren't supposed to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are an alternative. Okay, the question is we can understand perhaps how scientists may have some trouble accepting very, very ancient artifacts of the ages that I'm talking about. But how do they feel about things like maybe the walls in Peru and things like that, where you have huge masses of stone that appear to be
It's
perfectly matched to each other. In alternative history, there's some kind of division of labor. There's some people who look at that. Those things are within the limits of a human presence. They're considered to be a few thousand years old. And I've been particularly concerning myself with archaeological evidence showing that humans have existed more than 100,000 or 200,000 years. That's my specialty. And that's what I've focused on. It doesn't mean I'm not interested in these other things, and it doesn't mean that I don't know anything about them or have any ideas about them, but I haven't necessarily thought them through in complete detail that I could give you a really authoritative answer about that. But yes, there are many things, many mysteries in the world, archaeological mysteries, within the past few thousand years even. I mean, nobody's really come up with a really good explanation of how they built the pyramids. There are lots of different theories, but I don't think there's one that's completely won over everybody. There are these massive megalithic structures that you're talking about, where you have huge blocks of stone weighing tens of thousands of tons that have been put into very big structures, and as you say, they match. You can't even put a razor blade in between the joints. And I haven't seen any really good explanation of that either. I don't think that scientists today, I haven't even seen attempts by skeptics how to explain that. I'm not really familiar with them. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they don't even want to talk about it like it's an issue. So that's another way to deal with something, just be silent about it and don't even talk about it. That's another way. But I've seen places like that. Once I was invited to I spoke at a history of science conference in Beijing, and I saw some palaces there, where they have walls built around them, similar walls with just huge blocks of stone. I just couldn't even conceive. And they say, they know where these stones come from. They come from miles and miles and miles away. And you just wonder how they moved them, how they got them, how they put them all together. When you get into the alternative theories, I mean, some of them involve sound vibration that kind of softens the stones, and so that they fit together very nicely, or use of mystic powers to lift the stones. It's a whole interesting area. As I said, it's not my specialty. You know, I'm interested in it, but I wouldn't necessarily know any more than you would about it, except that I'm interested in these things. So maybe you'll have a speaker here sometime that can directly address those questions.
We've done the Coral Castle. They've been on the air quite a bit.
Uh-huh.
I had a quick question, Michael. There's always this talk about an apocalyptic ending to our race or our planet. And a lot of those theories involve polar shifts, yet I read your books, you sent them to me a long, long time ago, and there's documentation already based on iron ore of previous shifts that have happened in the magnetic field.
Yeah, it's a method of dating.
Dating, yeah.
That's a dating method, yes.
Yeah, I didn't know if that had come up because a lot of people are reading all this. There's 90% of the internet is rumor nowadays. Maybe it always was, but it's heavily inundated with just rumor and fear-mongering. And a lot of people are thinking that this magnetic shifting is this new thing that's never happened that's about to come around and wipe everybody out. Yet it's happened several times in the past. I don't remember the exact number from your book. It seems like 12. Sticks in my head, or was...
Well, in the recent times, I mean, it's... Oh, okay.
Just the magnetic shifts in the ore.
Well, there's a lot of talk these days about a coming shift in the magnetic poles. And the question is has this happened before? And yes, it has, and there's a scientific record of it in the layers of the Earth, because different minerals, if you examine them very closely, if you examine their magnetic properties, the magnetic crystals are lined up in different ways that reflect that. And actually, it's a dating method that, if you can detect a magnetic reversal in looking at the magnetic properties of different layers of, it's usually volcanic rocks that are considered to have this property, or igneous rocks, you can detect at different times the shifts, and that allows you to date strata, by seeing when the shift was. So it's one of the accepted forms of dating in geology and archaeology, and it happens periodically, but I don't think there's an exact period. I discuss that paleomagnetic kind of dating in the book here. I don't know if I can find the exact section, but they do have a standard chart, showing when the different reversals of the magnetic poles happen, and they're spaced at intervals of several 100,000 years. It's not something that happens every day. They're spaced at intervals of at least several 100,000, maybe even a million or more years. So that does happen.
Would that transition be instant, like overnight, over the course of a year, over the course of 10 years? Can they tell?
The way they explain it is that if you look at the north magnetic pole and south pole, for some periods of time they're very stable. And then the poles start wandering. The magnetic north pole and south pole, not shifting, but wandering. And they say that that's happening now. They're starting to wander around, and that is considered to be a sign of, some instability in the magnetic polarity of the Earth. Because the Earth, they say it's got molten iron in it, it's spinning around, it's kind of generating its magnetic field, and normally it's kind of stable. So you've got the north magnetic pole, south magnetic pole, stable, but then the field starts decaying somewhat. And I don't know exactly what reasons they propose for that. Maybe something's, the Earth, something about the molten metals inside is changing or something. I don't know exactly how they explain it. But one of the symptoms of a change is when the magnetic poles start sort of shifting around and wandering. And they say that's happening now. And that eventually it should just go, the north and south pole, magnetic poles should completely shift. But again, I'm not an expert on it. I'm just giving you a layman's reading of what I know from the same sources that you would probably be able to get the information from. Okay, so
I think a thank you's in order.
yeah. So I do want to thank all of you for taking the time to hear, and I'll stay here for a little bit longer. If anybody has a book they want signed or anything like that, I'll be over there.